A starving Navajo boy collapsed at a rancher's doorstep, and for that simple act of mercy, Clayton Reeves nearly lost everything. The real danger wasn't the child, but the men who followed, ready to ignite fear and hate with a single shot. Just when it seemed violence would swallow all, a child's voice and a carved stone bear shifted the course of fate. But just wait until you hear how this storm of fire, grief, and honor ended, and why justice, against all odds, stood its ground. The winter of 1879 blanketed the New Mexico territory in a stillness so heavy, even the wind seemed to surrender. Snow fell without pause, soft at first, then relentless, layer upon layer, until the land disappeared beneath it. The mesas stood like ancient sentinels, silent, stoic, draped in white. Out near the edge of that frozen nowhere sat a modest cattle ranch, weather-worn wood, a stubborn chimney, and a single lantern that flickered against the dusk. Inside lived Clayton Reeves, a man shaped by the land he called home. A widower, hardened by loss. His only companions, Boone, his aging Appaloosa horse, and a silence too familiar, the kind that comes after burying a child. 2 winters ago, his boy had fallen sick. Fever took him fast. Since then, Clayton lived by one rule: endure. Every day was a matter of grit, no room for strangers, no time for kindness. That night, the cold felt different, sharper. It chewed through the seams of his coat as he fastened the barn doors and turned toward the house. That's when he saw it. Movement, just beyond the fence line. Clayton's hand went instinctively to the rifle slung over his shoulder, but what stepped from the shadows wasn't a threat. It was a child, barefoot, barely 10, his skin raw from wind, shoulders hunched in nothing but torn cloth. A Navajo boy, alone in the snow. He didn't speak. He didn't even cry. He staggered forward as if every step cost him the last bit of life he had, and then, without a sound, collapsed face down into the drift. Clayton stood frozen, heart racing. His mind flashed with every warning he'd ever heard from the town. Don't trust them. Don't help them. You'll regret it. But this wasn't a raider. This wasn't an outlaw. This was a child, and he was dying. Without another thought, Clayton rushed forward, knelt in the snow, and lifted the boy into his arms. He weighed almost nothing, just bone and cold. Inside, the hearth was burning low. Clayton laid the boy down on a rug near the fire, unwrapped his own scarf, and reached for a worn shawl that once belonged to his wife. He draped it over the child's shoulders, with the care of someone remembering what it meant to hold something fragile. He opened the bread box. Only a half loaf of sourdough remained. He tore it in two and placed a piece into the boy's frozen hands. The child's fingers were trembling so badly he could hardly grasp it. But slowly, without a word, he began to eat. Not greedily, not fearfully, just quietly, like someone who hadn't tasted warmth or kindness in a long time. He never gave his name. He never spoke at all. Only his eyes, dark and unreadable, flickered in the firelight. Clayton didn't press. Some things don't need questions. That night, the man sat by the fire until sleep finally came. The boy, wrapped in shawl and silence, lay beside the hearth like a fading shadow. But when Clayton woke the next morning, the boy was gone. No footprints, no sound, just an empty spot where he'd lain and the faint scent of smoke still lingering in the air. All that remained was the shawl, neatly folded at the edge of the rug. 3 days passed. The wind howled through the canyons, carrying with it a silence that no longer felt empty. It felt expectant. Boone, Clayton's old horse, had grown restless, snorting at shadows, ears perked to every creak of frost and branch. On the 4th morning, just before the first light touched the sky, Boone began to whinny, not from cold, but fear. Clayton woke instantly. He stepped onto the porch, still half dreaming, the chill biting at his face. And then he froze. Across the valley floor, a fog like spilled milk crawled low over the snow. From within it, shapes began to move, one after another, silent, steady. Horsemen. First, a dozen, then scores, then hundreds. They emerged from the mist like ghosts of another world, riders clad in deerskin, beads, and bone, their faces painted, their weapons glinting under the first rays of a red dawn. The rising sun caught the steel tips of spears and rifle barrels. The sound of hooves muffled by snow was the only noise that accompanied them. At their center, mounted tall on a white Mustang, was a man unlike the rest. He wore a long cloak woven with raven feathers and turquoise, and though his face bore the weight of many winters, his eyes were sharp, watching, leading, and riding beside him. Was the boy. Clayton's pulse thundered in his ears. He stepped back into the cabin and shut the door with shaking hands. He didn't know what this was. A warning, retribution, ceremony. He reached for his rifle and loaded it slowly, whispering a quiet prayer, not of defiance, not of anger, of confusion. He had shown kindness, but would they see it that way? Had he broken some ancient rule, trespassed unknowingly on a line drawn long before he was born? The horses came to a halt at his gate. For a long moment, nothing moved. Then the tall elder dismounted alone. He approached slowly, hands empty, palms raised. Clayton stepped onto the porch. The rifle was heavy in his arms, his breath fogging the air between them. The man spoke, his voice calm, accented, but firm. "I am Chief Nez Talii," he said. "You fed my grandson when others would let him die." Clayton blinked. The rifle lowered, ever so slightly. His shoulders eased. The weight of tension began to melt into something else, relief. But it never had the chance to settle. A single crack shattered the morning air. The chief's chest jerked. His breath caught, and then he crumpled to the snow. Clayton dove for cover, the rifle clattering from his hands. Horses reared, the silence shattered into shouts of grief and fury. Another bullet tore past Clayton's porch beam. He turned. On the ridge above, two men crouched behind boulders, rifles raised. Town ranchers, familiar faces, faces that had always spoken too loudly about what belonged to whom. They were grinning. They had followed the boy's tracks, believing Clayton had betrayed his own kind. To them, kindness was treason. They pulled the trigger again. The Navajo warriors, blinded by grief, looked only at the smoke curling from the cabin. From their place below the ridge, they didn't see the snipers. They saw a man with a rifle. They saw the chief fall. They saw Clayton. And just like that, the ground cracked beneath a fragile piece. They believed the bullet had come from his porch. The flames came fast. Clayton stood rooted to the porch as the Navajo warriors surrounded the cabin, their voices sharp with grief, fury rising like the fire, catching on dry timber. Their words, foreign, fierce, cut through the freezing air like arrows. He didn't understand them, but he didn't need to. The barn roof ignited. From inside came Boone's scream, long, wild, and filled with terror. The smell of burning wood turned sharp as smoke rose in thick curls. Clayton took a step toward the barn, but it was already too late. A boy's cry pierced the chaos. The same boy Clayton had fed now stood just feet away, trying to speak over the uproar in broken English. "No, he saved me. He fed. He's not." His voice cracked, drowned by shouts. One of the warriors pulled him back, too blinded by pain to listen. Another, younger than the rest and burning with rage, stepped forward. Without a word, he lifted the butt of his rifle and struck Clayton across the face. The world spun. Clayton hit the ground, snow soaking into his coat, warm blood pooling in his mouth. He tasted iron. He saw boots, fire, movement. He didn't see what happened next, but he heard it. Down the hill, voices were raised, not in Navajo, but in fear. The townsmen, the real shooters, had been found, dragged by their coats through the snow. One of them was already limp, his shirt stained red. The other was pleading, his voice shrill, broken. But it changed nothing. Chief Nez Talii was gone. Clayton lay still. His ribs ached with every breath. He thought this would be his end, not in a blaze of glory, but in confusion, mistaken, alone. And then, through smoke and shouting, the boy stepped forward again. Tears streaked down his face as he shouted in Navajo, raw, urgent. Then again, in English loud enough to crack the night open, "He fed me, he saved me, he is not like them." The noise wavered. The storm of rage trembled for just a heartbeat. One warrior, young, furious, shouted back, pointing at the blood on the snow. Another raised his rifle, but before either could act, an older woman stepped from the crowd. Her hair was silver, braided with beads and feathers. Her hands trembled not with anger, but with sorrow. She moved past the rifles, past the firelight, and knelt beside Clayton. Her fingers touched the cut on his cheek, still bleeding. She didn't flinch. Her voice was quiet, but it carried over the stillness. "He saved our blood," she said. "He fed the cold child. Would we take his life for the sins of others?" The warriors looked at her, then at Clayton, then at the boy. Snow fell again, soft and slow, trying to cover what had burned. By sunrise, the wind had stilled. The fire that had devoured the barn was nothing but smoldering timbers and soft gray smoke. The snow, once pristine, was now scattered with ash and footprints. But no more blood was spilled. Vengeance had burned itself out. Down in the valley, the Navajo gathered in a wide, silent circle. They laid Chief Neztali to rest beneath a canopy of cedar smoke and the low rhythm of mourning drums. No words were spoken aloud. Grief didn't need translation. Tyan, the boy, knelt beside the grave. Ash clung to his cheeks like war paint. His small hands clutched the corner of the same shawl Clayton had wrapped around him days earlier. He didn't cry, but his silence echoed louder than tears. Up the hill, Clayton watched. His arm was broken. His hands were blistered black from pulling flaming beams away from the barn. Boone was gone. The cattle, the feed, the season's hope, all lost. But he was still standing, and in that moment, it was enough. When the burial ended, the warriors began to mount their horses. One by one, they turned toward the rising sun, ready to vanish into the canyon. No signal was given, no command. It was understood. But then, Tyan ran back. His boots thudded softly in the snow. In his hands was something small, wrapped in cloth. He stopped in front of Clayton, opened the bundle, and placed a carved stone bear into the rancher's hand. It was polished smooth, the size of a river pebble. It gleamed in the light. "It means strength," Tyan whispered. "My grandfather would have given it to you himself." Clayton looked down at the bear. His throat tightened. He tried to speak, but the words caught behind his ribs. All he could do was nod. Tyan smiled, just for a breath, and ran back to his people. And then they were gone. 300 riders vanishing into light and canyon rock, leaving only hoofprints and a quiet that felt different than before. Not empty, just still. Peace had returned, not with celebration, but with weight, like dust settling after a storm. Weeks later, the sheriff rode up from town. He asked questions, he looked at the scorched earth, the wreckage, the rebuilt fence posts. Finally he asked, "What happened out here, Clayton?" Clayton didn't hesitate. He didn't lie either. "A boy was cold," he said, adjusting the sling on his arm. "I gave him bread. The rest just followed." Then he turned and walked back into his house, past the ashes, past the bear carved from stone, and into the life he had left to rebuild.